So welcome to this third webinar. It's good to see you all here from wherever you are. And I'm just going to introduce myself. I'm Jan Webb. I'm the academic lead for the Open University Safeguarding courses that are funded by our donor, the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, FCDO. There are 3 safeguarding courses that we've been developing over the past 1.5 years. And these webinars which you're contributing or taking part in are part of the course 3, which is Leadership in Safeguarding in the International Aid Sector. It was a course that was developed specifically for those in leadership and governance positions, or those who aspire to those positions. And to date, we've had almost 670 learners globally who've registered on this course and have taken place in the online discussions with our trained educators. And these discussions are well underway. And we will share the link to course 3 in the chat box. And this is the final and the third webinar that we're hosting as part of the blended course to provide learners an opportunity to discuss the points raised in course 3. The webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared on the online course for learners to have access, as I said earlier. But I'm now going to hand over to Anita Williams, who is our international safeguarding consultant and our lead order for all of the 3 safeguarding courses. And Anita will be moderating the panel discussion. So over to you, Anita.
Thank you, Jan. Hello, everyone.
Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are in the world. And thank you for joining us from webinar 3, which is the final webinar for our course on leadership and safeguarding. Today, the webinar title is Importance of Good Governance and Organizational Oversight of Safeguarding in the International Aid Sector. This webinar has been designed to complement topics covered in week 4 of the course that you've been looking at and you've been discussing. And learners will remember that the topics we included in week 4 include the role and responsibilities of the board with regards to safeguarding, the importance of the board to manage the organizational risk of safeguarding people, a particular focus on how to recruit to a board to ensure diversity and inclusion and that it's purpose-driven in its focus, and the all-important accountability of the board to regulatory bodies, to donors, the public, senior management, as well as to staff. And as usual, today we have a panel of esteemed speakers for you to listen to and for you to interact. So I'm going to introduce them now. Professor Suzanne Scheel. Suzanne is an independent ethics consultant working with organizations across health and social care, the charity sector, and the criminal justice system. She authored the Share Review of Culture for Save the Children UK after allegations of sexual and other forms of harassment arose in 2018. So we'll hear a little bit more about her report. She holds many leadership positions, including a visiting professor at the Department of Security and Crime Science, University College London, and has published a book on moral leadership in medicine, building ethical healthcare organizations. So welcome to Suzanne. Number 2, we've got Dr. Judith Turbine. Dr. Judith has worked in international development for many years, including in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in local frontline organizations and with multinational funders. In the past, she was the CEO of Progressio Ireland and the head of engagement with OSCAR, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator. Currently, Judith is the Deputy Chair of the Cora Foundation and the CEO of charity known as Children in Scotland. Judith holds a PhD from the University of Bath, which has looked at empowerment in development. And last but not least, we have Tina Pham. Tina is the CEO of an international consulting firm, and she has 30+ years of experience in designing and delivering learning programs in governance, leadership, and safeguarding in the development sector. So learners will be very excited to know that we have a very well-informed and experienced panel today. So learners, we just want to encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions, which we will take at the end of the presentations. So let's kick off with our keynote speaker. Suzanne, as the lead author of the SHARE report on organizational safeguarding culture and good governance, could you please share with us what are some of the lessons learned, key takeaways and actions that all boards of international aid organizations should be aware of? Over to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anita, and hello to all those of you who have joined today's MOOC. It's a real privilege to come and talk to you both about some of the findings from my review for Save the Children, but also to hear some of your experiences, I hope, during the Q&A section in terms of leadership within this sector. So I am speaking today as someone who has experience and interests in leadership, particularly at board level, more so than particular insight into the humanitarian sector. And so there were three things that I wanted to share with you that I think are absolute key takeaways from the review that I did for Save the Children, which are not restricted to just safeguarding issues, and they're not restricted just to humanitarian organisations. I think they're challenges that confront leadership of organisations and perhaps haven't received sufficient focus in the past within the humanitarian and third sector. So the first thing that I'd wanted to talk about was thinking about organisational cultures. I don't know if the slide deck is going to move on at all, but my first point is that we very often talk about organisational culture, thanks. And it's easy to talk about organisational culture in the singular. And of course, organisations as a whole do have something of a kind of binding cultural cloth, if you like. But I think that the thing that we need to understand, and that boards sometimes lose sight of, is that your organisation consists of many cultural threads. And if you treat organisational culture, which includes the culture around safeguarding, as being homogenous across your organisation, then you run the risk of missing areas where you might have a hotspot where things are not working as well as they should do. I wanted to give one example of this from the review of Save the Children. So one of the things that we noted when we talked to people within the organisation was that depending on the department and sometimes the profession you're in, you had a different view of what was important and what needed to be paid attention to. So that when we spoke to people within the sort of policy development area, they were very, very clear that central to their work was thinking about gender and taking into account the need to weave some of their policy development around the needs of women. We then spoke with people in the fundraising area of the charity. And what they were experiencing was the pressure of needing to fundraise in a context where they didn't want to offend some of their major donors. And that meant that for staff working in those areas, they sometimes had to accept, they felt, both gender bias and a degree racial bias, and that was almost accepted as a part of the role. And they accepted it for what they saw as the greater good of the charity and its need to raise money for its work. So there were very different cultures and expectations sitting alongside different departments in the organisation. And I think that for a board really needs to understand how these pressures, cultures, goals and roles may impact differently within the organisation and affect both the safeguarding of staff, but also the safeguarding of your beneficiaries. The second thing that I would want to talk about, if we move on to the next slide, is to just be a little bit aware of board dynamics. We've gone forward one slide too far. Can we go back one? So the second key takeaway, I think, is to be aware of how boards respond to unwelcome information about your organisation and the way in which the response of the board will shape the willingness of people to bring unwelcome information to you. If you're going to lead your organisation effectively and be aware of some of the issues that it might have to be grappling with in terms of its internal cultures, you really need to hear from people throughout the organisation and to make it possible for them to bring unwelcome information to you. But just as importantly, what do you actually do with unwelcome information when it comes to you? And I think that there are some biases which it's worth being aware of, which affect all leadership groups. First question is whether or not there's a tendency sometimes to discount the severity of unwelcome information. And so to give you an example from the healthcare sector is one where death happens all the time. And there are some parts of the humanitarian sector where what happens to people is catastrophic, and it's easy for leaders to adjust thresholds of acceptability downwards to say, well, we wouldn't normally sanction this kind of behaviour, but these are extreme or very difficult circumstances. So I think that the key here is to work as a board together to maintain an appropriate threshold of concern that doesn't set aside some things as being unimportant by comparison with others. So, you know, is sexual harassment unimportant by comparison with the need to help children who are in desperate straits? So a second question is how far unwelcome information is taken for what it is. So that what can sometimes happen within leadership groups, whether they're boards or middle management leadership groups, is that you're presented with information which just seems too unlikely to be true. So it's discounted. You know, we really don't believe that this kind of racial bias might exist, you know, within some of our working groups, or it seems very unbelievable to us as somebody who we respect as a really good leader might be behaving in a covert manner in a way that's unacceptable towards some of their staff. You know, how come somebody committed to a humanitarian goal can nevertheless be bullying staff? So that tendency to kind of normalize unwelcome information into disbelief again needs to be corrected, and there needs to be awareness of it. The other thing that can happen, I think, with unwelcome information is it just immobilizes boards and leaders, and they put things into the too difficult box and focus on the things that they can feel that they can deal with. And I think that some of the things that can fall into the too difficult box include matters which might threaten important relationships that you have or threaten the organization's reputation. And then my last question really goes back to the opening point about how do you behave as a board or as leaders when unwelcome information comes to you? Do you thank people for bringing you unwelcome information, or does it become apparent to people that being the bearer of bad news is bad news for them personally within an organization? So the final set of things that I want to deal with, and it follows on really from the second set of key takeaways. So my third set of key takeaways is what makes raising concerns difficult. And if we can move on to the next slide, it's about, you know, understanding what makes raising concerns difficult for your staff. I work across the criminal justice system, so policing face this issue. I work within healthcare, and in healthcare we face this issue, and it's certainly an issue within the humanitarian sector. And I think generally speaking, there's a kind of shared naivety about how difficult it is for people to raise concerns within your organisation. And I think if we understand the social dynamics of this, first of all, people have to notice that something is unacceptable. So they have to see within their working environment and name a thing which is happening that seems to them not to be quite right. And then this notion of sort of blaming in that, it isn't about blaming individuals, but it's about saying this situation isn't right. I can see that there is something going on here, and I can locate it in some place. So having noticed that something is unacceptable, your member of staff then has to decide that they are going to act. And there's been a lot of research on recognizing the bystander effect, which may express itself in different ways. In the negative way, you look around and you think, well, nobody else is doing anything about this. So maybe it is, it's just me. I'm the person who's got a problem with this, and I'll set it on one side. Or you might think to yourself, someone else, this is someone else's responsibility. Someone else will do something about this. On the positive side, what we see with bystander effect research is that when one person steps up and steps forward, then it quite often encourages other people to, and they'll say, well, actually, I've seen that as well. So we need to be aware of how the bystander effect impacts. We need to, people need to anticipate that there's going to be a positive organisational response if they raise concerns. And this goes back to my previous point. If all that happens, and if all of the stories in your organisation are about people being stigmatised or disciplined or sidelined for raising concerns, then that discourages other people from doing it. So people need to anticipate there's going to be a positive organisational response that, far from being sidelined or demoted for raising concerns, this is something to be positively celebrated, and that you might even earn a promotion for it. They need to know that they're going to have a reasonable chance of a good outcome. So your organisations need to make sure that there is news out there about how acting on concerns really does make a difference, makes a difference to staff, to your beneficiaries, and potentially to your organisational reputation. And then additionally, people will weigh up the pros and cons of taking action. And there's been a lot of research about what might prompt people into taking action. There are certainly things that we know will discourage people from taking action, and anticipating retaliation and so on. But people will also make their own judgment about how serious an issue this is, and whether or not there are kind of good reasons for people doing the things that they find worrying. So people will quite often bring their own intuitive sense of justice to bear and say, well, how bad is this, or is it something that's excusable? So all of those things are going to be in the mind of somebody who has identified an issue and is contemplating raising a concern. So my question to boards is, how confident are you that your system will promote the activity of calling attention to concerns and mitigate any negative effects? And I think that we are over-reliant on a combination of individual goodwill and sometimes the threat of disciplinary action for people who don't raise concerns to get this stuff done. And I think if you stand back for a moment and really understand what it's like to be raising a concern, particularly a serious concern within an organisation, we can see that we need systems which actually attend to all of these possible sources of discouragement. And it absolutely is the board's responsibility to make sure that the systems in your organisation are going to support people who want to come forward and raise concerns. So I hope that's been helpful and not over long. I meant to switch my timer on when I started and I forgot. So I hope I haven't taken too much time.
That was perfect, Suzanne. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. You've just provided us some really thought-provoking information there, based on your, on your cultural review of SAFE, but also pulling into, the experience that you have in other sectors as well. I like what you're talking about, the speak up and speak out culture is something that we certainly support our beneficiaries to do so, at a programmatic level, but where does it sit in an organizational level? And you've emphasized the point about the fact that the board needs to be welcoming of concerns or unwelcome information, as you've labeled it. And actually, the fact is, the bystander effect could either have a positive or negative effect. The fact is that if more people step up, the more that the boards will have to be more welcoming, and therefore will have to provide more attention and certainly more support for that organizational culture shift. And this is what we're talking about, bringing about a more positive organizational effect to keep people safe internally within the organization, and externally, with the work that we're doing. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to move on now to Judith. Judith, the SHARE report sets out some of the gaps in safeguarding in a large international NGO. Does this resonate with your experience, your time with Oscar, or working with boards and your various senior management roles? And perhaps you can discuss some of these points using data or specific examples that board members could learn from. Over to you, Judith. Thank you.
Hello, nice to be here and to reflect a bit on that very excellent presentation that Suzanne just did. I felt I would take it back a little bit to my reflections, both now as CEO of a children's charity, but bringing in those perspectives from having been working with the regulators, the head of engagement, and also in my past life working in international development, and maybe just talk a little bit about actually the key themes which you may have covered in the seminar, but I think it's always quite good to come back to and to hold yourself to account on as a board, because also I am a board member as well, and so I see it from all these different angles. I think one of the things that you need to come back to when you're sitting on a board, or when you as chief exec are asking your board to do what it is that they need to do, is to really reflect on, well, what fundamentally is my role in all of this? Where do I sit? If I'm lucky enough to have a board and a staff complement, which we know that many charities in Scotland do not, then how do we separate that oversight role, that strategic role, from that operational day-to-day role? And how do I make sure that what's happening at an operational level is really dealing with, as you're pointing out, these concerns, these issues that can come up? So I think that one of the things that is very important, and I think you come back to, and I don't think you can overstress, is the overall collective responsibility of the board. And I think that is something that is quite hard to grasp sometimes. And when we talk about how to make safeguarding, whether you're talking about the core looking after vulnerable beneficiaries, or whether you're looking at the wider cultural aspects of that, when you're talking about that, what does that mean in terms of how do we take collective responsibility for that? So very often what happens is we think, oh, let's put some specific person on the board who's got great experience in safeguarding, who's got a great experience in this area, and that will solve our problem. And ultimately that doesn't solve the problem. That's a great thing to do, to have a more, what I would call, an intelligent board that has the people sitting around the board table to have the right discussions, to make sure that you've got the right things in place to have real oversight of what's going on. But it isn't fundamentally enough. We, as a board in the Cora Foundation's state, or my board for children in Scotland, have a collective responsibility to make sure we get that stuff right. And I think if you take that on board as a board, it's much more likely to make you ask the questions that you need to be asking of your staff, of the people who are implementing your policies at an operational level. So I think that's very important. And I think also the other thing is, I'm taking it back to fundamentals. What are my duties as a trustee? And the duty that this comes back to in Scottish charity law is to do with care and diligence. And it's to do with that level of care and diligence that takes it beyond the care and diligence I would use as an individual about my own affairs, to something that's bigger than that, that's something that's more important than that. So you've got things in charity law that tell you what you need to be doing, that tell you what you need to be doing at a sort of holistic level within the board. But that's challenging, I think. It's challenging to get that sense of what collective responsibility means and what does it mean in practice. So you have an intelligent board, it's taking collective responsibility. You've probably got a safeguarding person on that board, or somebody, in the case of Children in Scotland, we have somebody who's particularly in charge of child protection, or not in charge, but has a specific role in terms of child protection. But what do you do? What does that mean in practical terms, in terms of what the board needs to do? And what do you see when that doesn't go right? I think that what you need is really for your directors, in our case in Children in Scotland, directors or trustees, to be holding the organisation to account, to create that safe environment. You need to be making sure that you have the policies and procedures in place, and you need to be able to revisit that as often as you need to. You need to be sure that the right training's in place and you have oversight of that. But I think, and this is where I'd maybe quite like you to bring up the slide that I had, how do you actually do that in practice, and how do you make sure it's embedded across the organisation? Because when you get it wrong, what you see is the mistakes that we're talking about. You see concerns not be taken seriously enough. And in Children in Scotland, our way of dealing with this is not so much around the code of conduct side. That's one way of going down the route. It's really about pinning ourselves to our values and making the values the core of what we talk about at everything, within the board, within induction, within training, within our monthly meetings with staff. We come back to our values, because one of the challenges I think you have as a board is that you can have the best policies and procedures in place. You can have lots of good stuff there, but actually, how do you make it an environment where people do feel confident enough to bring concerns, but also where the person who might be getting criticised or a concern raised about feels safe in that challenge? How do you create that environment where you can have these open, honest, transparent and conversations that can actually make a difference for your organisation? So for us within Children in Scotland, it's really about saying, okay, are we living by these values? Are we working by these values? Can we actually see that our staff are doing what they need to do in terms of values? So yes, do we have the policies and procedures? Yes. Are we visiting them? Are we training our staff? Yes. But fundamentally, can we have those conversations that can be very difficult, and can we have them in a way that makes everybody safe? Because one of the challenging things I've seen in previous roles is that it's not just about raising concerns. Can be difficult, but you're often put in a very vulnerable position if you're the person who the concern, and I'm not talking about myself personally, but if you're the person who the concern is raised against, how can they feel safe, and how can they be assured that the process that's going to be followed is a process that's right and just for everybody? And so it comes back to me to having an organisation, and this sounds a little bit airy-fairy, but I think in practice, if you pin yourself to your values, if you talk about your values, if you know what they mean in practice, and if you can have conversations at a practical level, every month we have them every month with staff, if you can do that, then that will allow you to have a safe way to come back and have those difficult conversations about whether or not we are actually creating the culture that will allow us to be safe and secure in terms of that core safeguarding piece, in terms of how we're treating beneficiaries, their right to be safe, their right to be safe and secure in our care and our support. But we're also making sure that our staff feel they can raise concerns in a way that they will feel protected on all sides, to be able to have those difficult conversations, and to sometimes, let's face it, make a mistake, but then to be able to have that conversation, to then learn from that mistake and to actually make the organisation a better place. And so therefore I would like to finish by, because I think I've talked for long enough, because we really want to be having that discussion. I think one of the things that ultimately you want as a board is to be a learning organisation. So it's one of the things is you don't get things right all the time. Things happen, things go wrong, things are difficult. So actually bringing that back to the board and having that conversation around what does that tell us about how we're succeeding or not succeeding? What does that tell us about our culture? Do we have the measure to really understand what our culture is saying to us, and to have those conversations and to be deliberate and to be reflective about that, without expecting everybody to get it right all the time, but to know that you have a way of bringing yourselves back so that you can try to be as good as you possibly can be with your organisation, with the staff that you have, and with the resources that you have. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Some really good information that you've provided us there. Some challenges as well from your understanding and experience. You've talked about the collective responsibility of the board, something that week 4 in our course really emphasized on, and that understanding of the operational side. I mean, how many of our boards actually do understand how the organization does things, and from the different perspectives of the different teams. I like what you said as well about the care and diligence provided to the work that we're doing at board level would be certainly higher than the one that we would exercise perhaps for our own individual issues. And then emphasizing the emphasis on values, organizational values, and this not just to be put on websites and to be talked about, but really lived out. And how do you then live out those values certainly at board level? And that challenge as well to be a learning organization. So thank you very much. So I'm now handing over to Tina. Tina, from your experience being or supporting boards in the various 30-odd years that you've been working in and around this field, how important is it to have a purpose-driven, diverse board to improve organizational safeguarding culture, particularly in the international aid sector? And, it'd be great to hear some examples of this as well. Over to you, Tina. Thank you.
Hello, I was muted. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this webinar today. It's a subject very close to my heart. And I think that it's vitally important that diversity lies at the heart of any board leadership arrangement in all organisations, but particularly in the international development sector. So I hope during my presentation, I'll be able to challenge the sector and also answer that question more directly. Can I have my next slide, please? So you'll note from my first slide, a slight amendment to what was on the webinar programme, because I have posed the title for my session as a question. And I'd like you to bear this question in mind as we go through this short presentation. Really, is diversity necessary for a purpose-driven board? A quick overview of what I plan to cover, which is on the next slide. You'll see that we'll go through what a purpose-driven board is. I really don't want to assume that we understand, so we have a shared understanding. And then we'll answer the question that has been raised to understand the purpose of a board. Where does equality, diversity, and inclusion fit in? And then I think that it's then over to you, that the question will be what you do next, because I strongly believe that change needs to happen within the sector. Next slide, please. A key question remains that how important, where does purpose fit in to board leadership? In fact, where does purpose fit into our boards at all? If we ask organisations within the sector, do they have the best people on their boards? Are they doing their utmost to attract the right people to their boards? The questions will probably be mixed, because research shows that for many people, membership of a non-profit board is a key ambition. It looks good on the CVs. And organisations obviously often cite the fact that board members are voluntary and are not paid, means that they often can't be too critical about who they're able to attract to sit on their boards. This position is really not good enough, and we need to take a step back. So a webinar such as this, given that it's now come as part of our third cohort of this safeguarding course, aimed specifically at leadership, is really timely. Board membership at its heart requires an alignment of purpose, our why at its core. But very few boards are taking sufficient care. I like the way Judith described it as care and diligence in determining who sits, who provides that strategic leadership role. And once board members are often, or trustees are attracted and recruited, purpose thereafter is assumed, while they then get on with the business of leading the board. You'll see from the slide that purpose needs to sit at the heart of what the board does day in, day out. Vision, mission, values, these are often referred to, but ultimately it is about ensuring that the purpose remains at the core. The Shell report shows that processes and procedures are no remedy if there is a misalignment of purpose. And organisations basically have attracted the wrong people to their boards for the wrong reasons. Next slide, please. Purpose-driven board leadership is underpinned by 4 core components. And those of you who have been following our latest course will be familiar with these. The first, very quickly, is purpose before organisation. And that is keeping a vision on the organisation's purpose and not getting drawn in to the detail of running the organisation or the organisation relying on the expertise of board members. Now, board members are not unpaid consultants. It is about respect for the ecosystem, acknowledging the organisation's actions can be both positive and negative in terms of impact, and a commitment to being respectful and responsible within that wider ecosystem. An equity mindset in advancing equitable outcomes and interrogating and avoiding ways in which the organisation's strategic and work priorities may reinforce systemic inequalities, and authorise voice and power, recognising that organisational power and voice must be authorised by those impacted by the organisation's work. Next slide, please. So this boils down to the what. And the what needs to be a dynamic process, not a static one of we always do, run the board in a particular way. The who, the board needs to attract confident and curious people who are able to challenge and speak truth to power. And the how, it needs to be participatory and innovative. Too many boards adopt a tick box mentality to their responsibility. We have 4 meetings a year that last 2.5 hours. No, this is not correct. A board director or trustee, the role is 24/7, 365 days of the year for each year the individual is appointed. We need to start thinking outside of the box. Next slide, please. So when it comes to diversity, I'm going to just cut to the chase. Board leadership within the sector is not diverse. And this has been brought home by a recent report by Bond, which interviewed and recorded the testimony of many people of colour working within the sector. It was quite soul-destroying in terms of reading. The sector is not diverse, and I'm not convinced that there is a commitment to diversity in the international development sector, which I find worrying. and I believe poses huge risks for safeguarding going forward. Boards need to take recruitment seriously. It's predicated on trust, as the Shell report identified, but they need to be much more proactive in their succession planning and start the process earlier. They need to show much more humility and, in my opinion, ditch intermediaries such as headhunters, who I believe can get in the way of communicating much around purpose regarding the role. I think that the purpose of how diversity can make an impact is often lost in translation when third-party intermediaries such as headhunters are recruited. But from what we see of this slide, 78%, over 3/4 of board members are white, 75% have a household income of over £100,000, and 71% are recruited informally. So it is not diverse, and nothing will tell me otherwise. There's too much talk and not enough action. Next slide, please. So purpose-driven board leadership for an effective board requires a multitude of skills. And what is also soul-destroying and an own goal by many organisations is that learning and development rarely encompasses the board, and excuses are often given. Board members are unpaid, they're very busy people, we can't encroach upon their time. But you'll see from this, influencing, leading without direct authority with a leadership team is very challenging, is very difficult. And these are skills that need to be learned. So very often organisations are not investing in the development of their board, and this needs to change if we want different outcomes. Next slide, please. Safeguarding has highlighted risks in international development that sadly have come to the fore in other contexts. If we are determined that this is never to happen again in the sector, we need to be vigilant. We need to understand and recognizing what safeguarding risks are and how they manifest, and we can learn this from different contexts. We need to have the humility to know that we don't have all the answers, and we will never. That's the nature of a safeguarding risk. But the readiness to learn lessons from different contexts. Next slide, please. Strategic leadership has many facets, and a purpose-driven board has got to recognise this. Again, we need to stop looking at board leadership within the sector with tunnel vision and look at the many ways in which board members can contribute. And that is where diversity is key. People will come from different backgrounds, life experiences, expectations, and they will bring all of this to enrich a board. And that should be the aim of every board within the sector. Next slide, my final slide. In answer to Anita's question, how important is it to have a purpose-driven and diverse board to ensure and improve safeguarding, a safeguarding culture? Well, I believe it's absolutely fundamental, non-negotiable, and goes to the heart of what the international development sector's promises is to those who rely on their services. When the sector fails, it fails on its promises to some of the poorest and most vulnerable people on the planet. Now, I've given an answer, but I want you to look at this slide very closely, because in it, it shows one of my days as a commissioner in India. There you'll see a group of women, all with brown skin. And there was something very special that happened at that meeting. It was a case of brown women one brown woman talking to another brown woman. You really couldn't tell who was who had flown in from the UK and who was local in that context. And I think many organisations, by not including diversity, be it on the board or within the organisation and leadership teams, are really missing an important lesson and disserving the communities that rely on them, those that they seek to serve. I think that Sarah Champion, chair of the International Development Committee, put it in much more eloquent words. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you for sharing as well your experiences on the field in relation to when you were commissioner. So colleagues, just opening up the floor now to participants to please put your questions or your comments on the chat box. We do have about 15 minutes left on the webinar, so feel free to do that. Let me get the ball rolling. Suzanne, I'm going to come back to you. Something that you said that was really interesting. You talked about cultural threads, and you talked about the fact that safeguarding is not homogenous, you know, because we come at it from different angles, and you gave the example of the fundraising team. But you also said that the boards need to shape the willingness of people to be able to come forward, and that certainly is important because they set the tone at the top. But you also, the challenge is bias. Bias can affect the way people will perceive this at leadership angles and discount the severity of unwelcome concerns. Maybe you'd like to share a little bit, and then I'll move on to the other speakers for their, you know, for their thoughts on that. Over to you, Suzanne. Thank you.
It's an interesting question, Anita, because I think when I was planning my contribution, I was thinking about a generalized cognitive bias, which is a reluctance sometimes to deal with what I would call unwelcome information. I think the interesting thing about connecting this with what Tina has just said about diverse boards is that I think having a diverse board is one of the protections against that kind of cognitive bias. Because, you know, if I think about the way in which the sector has dealt with issues around gender, around race and ethnicity, the tendency to discount as unimportant the experiences of people of colour and of women is all the easier if you happen to be a white man sitting on a collectively white board. So it's both about a general cognitive distaste for hearing things that you don't really want to hear, but it's also about finding oneself as part of a group where that distaste isn't challenged by somebody who's going to say, you know what, you really need to pay attention to this because it may not be your experience, but it is very definitely the experience of others. So I think there is a connection between those two. I think the other thing that I just wanted to emphasize, and I feel this really strongly from healthcare, and again, just picking up Tina's point about learning from other sectors, there's one thing that we really do know in healthcare, which is that it can look as though your entire organisation is doing fabulously well on the safeguarding and raising concerns front, except for one little bit, which is hidden away. And I think boards really need to understand which bits of their organisation are impervious. We've seen this, Tina put the slide up of the Shrewsbury Hospital. And one of the things which came out of the Ockenden report was a wonderful description of what was viewed as the so-called Republic of Maternity. In other words, the maternity department division was running itself according to its own lights, and it was being allowed to get on with it. So the NHS Trust, of which I'm on the board, runs a lot of services in prisons and forensic mental health care. And those are exactly the kind of places which can be impervious to oversight, because they are literally hidden behind high walls and security and so on. So I think it's beholden on boards to say, what are the bits of our organisation where we're less likely to see something going wrong. And as part of the review of Save the Children, I wasn't asked to look at overseas deployments, but one phrase kept on coming back to me, which was raised internally, is people would say, well, what happens on deployment stays on deployment. And that's the kind of thing that really starts to make me concerned for the way in which there are different cultures in different parts of the organisation, and that those who are doing something a long way away from base can get away with stuff that they wouldn't be doing in the office.
Some really good points there, absolutely right. I think the fact that the training in the sector, and certainly for our boards to build up their expertise in the area, is so much needed. Several questions coming in for Tina before I hand over to her. Judith, maybe you'd like to reflect a little bit about as well, the role and responsibility of the board to set the cultural tone at the top, and how actually bias and other challenges come into the fray when decisions are being made to deal with safeguarding concerns. Thank you.
Yeah, well, probably the first thing is to come back to what Tina was talking about in terms of it sort of starts at recruitment, at the time of recruitment. So, what is the perfectly diverse board? There's no such thing, right? Because there's loads of skills and loads of different backgrounds you want to see on that board. But what you need to be doing is striving to make sure that you are have a level of representation that feels real and authentic in terms of the people you're working with. And that's not always easy, because people need to be interested, they need to come forward, you need to find a way of reaching different people. But one of our challenges is always that we have at least to have 2 younger trustees on the board. So so one of those is we've got a young woman of 20 and a young man of 21, and that's a recent recruitment that we've had. I think another real challenge, yes, there's a question in the box about is it just men and women, is it just black and white? No, it definitely is not, because actually if you look at a lot of boards in Scotland now, you've got many boards that are dominated by women in terms of charity sector, parts of the charity sector. So it's not just men and women, it's not just black and white. It's like one of the challenges actually very often is the socio-economic dimension, which is very, very difficult to fulfill on a board. How do you actually get people coming forward, and how can you support them, and how can you make it feel like it's something for them? Because it's kind of for them, I'm talking about as if I'm not them and us, for everybody. How can somebody feel that they have the competence to come forward? So that recruitment challenge will be an ongoing challenge, but you can chip away at it. You definitely can, through where you're I think Tina was talking about being purpose driven, be very clear what it is your organization does and what you're looking for the routes to find people in different places than you may have found before. And then recruiting, we recruit with values at the heart of our recruitment. So we have somebody from our young persons advisory board on the recruitment panel. So, sort of building these things in, so bit by bit, you're sort of changing that dimension across the board, and not just thinking you can look at a board and understand whether it's diverse or not. There's elements of it you can look at. There's other elements that, it's a challenge to get them around a board. So it's an ongoing challenge. You have to keep asking yourself the question if you're doing enough. And each time you come to a board recruitment, you have to look at it again. Don't just assume that what you did last time was the right thing. And then I think you're creating that environment on the board, which again isn't easy, but so that the board members themselves can feel confident in raising issues and having them taken seriously and discussing and so on. And again, that's about an atmosphere. It's about the chair and the approach of the chair to that meeting. It's about the induction of the charity trustees. It's a whole set. I'm warbling on now, so I'll stop. But I do think that if you start at the very beginning with that mindset, then you will go a long way to having a board that will be able to question and keep on top of these.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Judith. So Tina, you've made some really good points, and obviously some of the information in your slides have been part of week 4, the information provided at week 4. There have been questions regarding the study, and the study can be found, colleagues, on step 4.6 in the course materials. It's board source, leading with intent. But certainly Tina can explain a little bit more about that study. Tina, maybe the question for you then, taking it as well, the points you made earlier and the points that Suzanne and Judith made, you know, when we talk about diversity, is it just about color? Is it just about gender? Or, you know, what are we looking at, and what would be helpful, I think, for boards? You know, Judith made the point that because they work with children, they've got 2 young people sitting on the board, you know, that represent the beneficiary group that they work with. What are some of the other good examples you've seen, Tina, when it comes to diversity, equality, and inclusion? Thank you. Oh, you're on mute. You're still on mute.
Well, thank you very much for that question. First of all, I make no apology about race. I'll just say that bluntly. And I really get very frustrated. I'm now 60 years of age, so I've been round the block a few times, when people sort of raise a number of issues when we talk about diversity. At the end of the day, I think race is particularly significant when it comes to discrimination, and I'll say no more given time. I'm speaking now from my own life experiences. I want to give you 2 examples that may highlight and answer your question, Anita, in a different way. A month ago, I attended a meeting of an organisation that said all the right things about diversity on boards, this, that, and the other. Around the table were 5 people, myself and another Black person and 3 white people. The person leading the meeting for 80% of the time made eye contact with the 2 white people only. So going back to Suzanne's point, you may have the diversity around the board, but the power, those who matter, are concentrated between a reserved few. And you get the message loud and clear that you're here for diversity, you're here so we can tick the box, but really it's these 2 people or these 3 people that are the driving force. So that's my experience, and that's my answer. It's not good enough. And I'm currently working my way out of that organisation because it's a waste of my time.
Yeah, I hear you, Tina. I completely.
The second point I want to make that refers to Judith's point is that during the course of my career, I have excelled at audit, and I have chaired audit committees, but I'm not a qualified accountant. I'm dyslexic. I only was recently diagnosed as dyslexic, and I found out that dyslexics make excellent analysts. So there is a case for neurodiversity. In fact, there are cases for including people. And it goes back to what I said in my presentation about purpose. If purpose is the focus, if there is that alignment focus with purpose, then the right people will be attracted to the organisation for the right reasons. And it's then about the organisation doing the right thing.
Excellent, thank you so much. Also the point about neurodiversity, something that we need to certainly look into. Very quickly, last question, and I'm going to hand it over to Suzanne. Suzanne, the question has been, you know, the report was 2018, 2019. It may be unfair to ask you if you've not been asked to come back to say, but have you seen changes for the better or for the worse at board levels when it comes to safeguarding? And there is an interesting point about resourcing. You know, have you seen an increase of resourcing and safeguarding, or maybe even paying board members so that they take this in a much more professional level? Thank you, Suzanne.
So to try and provide a brief response to that, we went back and did a review for Save the Children to see how they were going with implementing what we'd set out as actions for them. And this connects with something that Judith had in her slide about the values of their organisation and trust being so central to them. Because I think the thing that Save had to do was to trust their staff to carry forward what was a very demanding set of recommendations and to unleash them to get on with it. And I think that that can be lacking in organisations, that we forget. So, sometimes those who are at the head of organisations take almost too much responsibility and control and don't place that in the hand and empower the people in the organisation who very often know more about what needs to be done than the board does. So I can't speak more broadly about the sector other than, kind of anecdotally having had conversations with others in the sector. I think that period around 2017, 2018, and particularly with the challenges that we faced, were a bit, as I see it, a bit of a turning point in the sector. And I think that one of the things that did come to the fore, and it was so interesting hearing Tina talk today, was about how the aid sector has an issue around white saviorism, if I can put it that way. And I think that there has been, a lot of really positive debate in the sector about standing back from that kind of cultural position and recognising their accountability to the people that they are ultimately serving as beneficiaries, and the need to co-produce with those people rather than tell them what to do.
Co-create and co-produce. I feel loath to end this session, but we are out of time, and there have been so many thought-provoking, information and experiences that you shared. Thank you to all our panelists. Colleagues, I'm sure you want to thank them as well, so feel free to write your thanks on the chat box, to Professor Suzanne Schell, Dr. Judith Turbine, and to our very own Tina Pham. Thank you so much for your time, your contributions, and your excellent thought-provoking input for this afternoon. Thank you, colleagues. The recording for this session will be put on our course materials. It's there for you to look back on, to discuss and to continue your debates. Thank you, everyone. Take care and God bless.